So like I mentioned in a previous episode, I discovered the music of Emerson, Lake and Palmer back in high school through a cassette copy of Brain Salad Surgery given to me by my classic rock uncle. A life-changing recording it was. I remember being mesmerized by their style and musicianship. Like Led Zeppelin, ELP's impact was profound on my teenage self and ignited my fandom into finding the rest of their discography. With limited purchasing funds, I went for 1994's The Best Of compilation with Tarkus the Obvious Piece de Resistance that just enhanced my appreciation for all the other tracks here. Knife Edge became one of my favorites, and acoustic anthem Lucky Man was just a perfect soundtrack for my early years. Those were the days when a pack of nylon strings was all you needed. My ELP discovery path continued with a bootleg DVD at a record store. It was Masters from the Vaults, capturing the band's December 1970 show at Zurich, Switzerland. This opened the door into a new dimension, the visceral side of ELP, the performers. I recognized Knife Edge from the setlist, but that was it. I was in for a journey of heavyweight improvisation and a superb musical instinct, that of classical composers time traveling into the 20th century. From rockstar wizard Keith Emerson's commanding stage presence, including stabbing knives into his Hammond organ, to virtuoso Carl Palmer's frenetic drumming speed that never lost an ounce of consistency. It was a spectacle that couldn't be unseen. All this, of course, was held together by the grounded cable wisdom and sensibility of legend Greg Lake. One sit down of this concert and I was hooked. Where other bands on stage identity took several tours or years to develop, these guys had the blueprint from the start. I decided to get the rest of their studio albums, but they never matched the overall experience I felt with Brain Salad Surgery until I got my hands on a CDR copy of their debut. It was a marvelous showcase of skill, melody, and tasteful arrangements. Everything the band became famous for is here. An 8-song attack of mean progressive rock with no filler but cinematic artistry. They set the bar quite high for themselves, the mark of a true artist. Now, it was the soft touch of Take a Pebble what forever sold me into the timeless quality of such a perfect beginning for the absolute kings of 70s progressive rock. They took a pebble and cast it to the sea. The ripples unfolded into larger-than-life events, beautifully disturbing the waters of the ordinary existence for waves of sonic revolution. Welcome to the untold story of how this power trio supergroup really came to be. It wasn't an overnight thing like mainstream media wants us to believe. This is a detailed recollection of events and their respective journeys that shaped their musical identities before a single note was played as ELP. This is the making of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's debut, 1970. Our story begins with ELP's oldest member, Keith Emerson, born November 2nd, 1944. That's the same year Jimmy Page was born. With classical music studies as a teenager, plus a passionate self-taught jazz career, Keith was a talented artist from the beginning. He purchased an L100 Hammond organ in the early 60s, thanks in part to a loan from his father Noel, an amateur pianist himself. From this point on, he started playing piano bar gigs and local pubs. By 1965, he'd been a frequent performer in backing bands who toured the UK and Europe. It was these travels where Emerson got to know musicians like him on the quest for a big break beyond Faceless Sightmen. Past the breakup of Gary Farr and the T-Bones, where Keith and bassist Lee Jackson played, British psychedelic rock band The Nice was born, with the help of David Ollist on guitar and Brian Davison on drums. David Ollist used to play for The Attack, who released Hi-Ho Silver Lining almost at the same time as Jeff Beck in March of 1967. When your tires off, The Nice was briefly cast as the backing band for American soul singer P.P. Arnold in May 1967 before going into their own thing. Like Led Zeppelin a year later, The Nice went into Olympic Studios London to record their debut album in autumn of 1967 with engineer Glyn Johns. The 8-track record featured original compositions, plus Dave Brubeck's 1959 Blue Rondo a la Turk, as well as some snippets by Johann Sebastian Bach thrown in a couple of songs. This moment right here is crucial in the Emerson and Palmer story. All records by The Nice would showcase Keith Emerson's ability to incorporate classical music into the rock and roll format like very few in the business. Where the Moody Blues and Procol Harum ventured into symphonic textures as a songwriting tool, Keith Emerson went wild, like Mozart.
See what Dave wrote there. For Keith, with many thanks for your 4/4 version.
The full version of
well, yes.
Blue Rondo la Turk.
Well, of course, yes, because he did actually write it in 9/8, which is, you know. And I played it in 4/4.
The Nice heavily toured the British circuit from October to December 1967, which included a couple of shows in Denmark, next to names like Jimi Hendrix and Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd. As you think, Keith Emerson's high-level showmanship became one of the band's strong selling points. Among early devoted fans of this band was a young Tony Banks, who later said he based Genesis' track by the name of The Knife on Keith Emerson's work at the time. Roadies for The Nice included Lemmy Kilmister, who handed Emerson the famous dagger to stab his Hammond organ. Thank you, Lemmy.
Thanks a lot, you're great. This next one is something that takes on a sort of a symphonic form. It's something that we wrote, and it consists of a prelude and 3 movements.
1968 was a busy year for The Nice, with their debut album released on March 1st, just 3 days before Mothers of Invention were donated for the money. They also got a new manager in the ways of future Genesis 8 and Charisma Records founder Tony Stratton Smith, and they played 48 concerts, including their first ever US visit at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Los Angeles. Their July 1968 single, America, was an instrumental take on the famous bit from West Side Story. It received strong radio airplay, and it's regarded as the band's most popular tune. Now, the group's August 26th Royal Albert Hall performance had Keith Emerson burning an American flag while playing their brand new number on stage. The Nice were banned from the venue. It's funny to see Emerson play Royal Albert Hall in 1992 with the LP, knowing that back in '68 he was hugely criticized for this. It was a punk moment almost 10 years before punk itself. To think punk will later point fingers at musicians like Keith Emerson, right? So back to The Nice. The band's lineup changed around October, with David Ollist out of the picture. Guitarist Steve Howe auditioned and got the job, but changed his mind a week later and left. Ars Longa Vita Brevis was the second album by The Nice, released in late 1968. Beyond the psychedelic rock songs, it featured an almost 20-minute 5-part piece with their own version of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto. This was Keith Emerson's first time working with an orchestra, and also the first long-side progressive rock track next to Procol Harum's own venture into these ambitious works. The album also included intermezzo from the Karelia Suite, adapted from Finnish composer Jan Sibelius. We have to thank The Nice for their rock and classical music crossover that opened many doors into the future. June 1969. Past 27 concerts in both the UK and main rock and roll clubs in America, The Nice went to the studio for the third time, now as a power trio, with Emerson, Lee Jackson, and Brian Davison.
Pregnant with promise and anticipation, but it's murdered by the hand. Everything she needs, she's an artist. Don't look. Stop all the night time and she makes the daytime.
Driving in close proximity through every British city hungry for rock and roll innovations was King Crimson, with its first lineup of Robert Fripp, Michael Giles, Ian MacDonald, Peter Sinfield, and Fripp's longtime friend, Greg Lake, born on November 10, 1947, in the southwest county of Dorset. Formed in late 1968, they played 30 shows by the time they went into Wessex Sound Studios, London, to record their debut album on July 7th through the 13th. Now, this was just 2 days after their breakthrough gig of playing for 500,000 people at Hyde Park as an opening act for the Rolling Stones' free concert. With a simple title of Nice, the third release by The Nice featured both studio and live material. It was released in August 1969, almost in time for the Isle of Wight festival, held that same month. Among the artists on the bill were both The Nice and hot new progressive rock band King Crimson. The Nice kept themselves busy beyond the stage, recording one track for Roy Harper's Flat Baroque and Berserk around September.
Fancy and all of you here, well I don't know. Fancy and all of you here, dressed up in your government gear.
King Crimson enjoyed great critical acclaim for their debut in The Court of the Crimson King, released on October 10th, 1969. Positive comments from names like Jimi Hendrix and Pete Townsend turned the band into one of the most promising British acts for the new decade. The Nice saw a new milestone in their concert agenda, being commissioned a piece of music for the Newcastle Arts Festival, inspired by the 5 bridges between the city and the town of Gateshead. A full performance with an orchestra was recorded on October 17th at Fairfield Hall, Croydon, with, you guessed it, King Crimson as opening act.
Bridges cross the Tyne and the city sits close by.
The Nice embarked on their final US tour November through December of 1969. By this time, Keith Emerson felt there was nowhere to further develop the band's musical style, and bassist Lee Jackson's vocals were not versatile. Keith made offers to both Jack Bruce and future Yes giant Chris Squire, but they said no. Emerson was running out of ideas for his future. Now also on the road in America for the first time was King Crimson. Both the Nice and Crimson played similar US venues like the Boston Tea Party on their respective itineraries, before sharing the stage at San Francisco's Fillmore West on December 12th. Keith Emerson and Greg Lake coincided during a sound check. Greg played a bass line and Keith added his chops on top. Rock history was made, and they began discussing the possibility of putting a new band together. Now, why would Greg Lake consider leaving King Crimson? Well, nobody in the band could predict success coming in so fast, thus internal fractures occurred. Giles and MacDonald wanted to go for a lighter musical style, while Robert Fripp preferred the unknown areas of progressive rock. This difference in vision compromised the band's future. Greg Lake was only 22 years old in December of 1969, and he was no faceless bandmate, but a key contributor in King Crimson. From 21st Century Schizoid Man to the captivating vocals in Epitaph, his voice had character, and his bass lines had extraordinary confidence. Keith Emerson was already a star in the rock and roll circuit. He was in the same place Jimmy Page was before finding Jones, Plant and Bonham for Led Zeppelin after the Yardbirds. While Robert Fripp would become one of the godfathers of prog with a loyal cult following in the genre, Greg Lake was a full-time musician since age 17 and waited his options. Working with the showman and classical music virtuoso from the Nice was a sound career move, but risky. To leave King Crimson at the height of its debut album buzz was both brave and insane. The Nice played 13 concerts in 1970 before breaking up for good in March. This last series of shows included a historic collaboration with the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra in February, next to famous conductor Zubin Mehta. This is a one-of-a-kind event with guest spots by Woodstock-era Santana and The Nice, plus both bands collaborating for Soul Sacrifice. Yeah, that's Keith Emerson, Jose Chapito Reyes, Mike Shreve, Carlos Santana, and Mike Carabello joining forces. It's one of my personal favorite classic rock moments. Now, Greg Lake went into the studio for the second and final time with King Crimson, January through April 1970, to record In the Wake of Poseidon. Lake sang on 5 tracks, plus an acoustic guitar credit on Cadence and Cascade. Greg's voice really elevates the material, and I just need to say it, Crimson's first 2 albums are my favorites from their entire discography. Lake certainly has something to do with that. April 1970 had Keith Emerson and Greg Lake out of their respective bands. Ideas were thrown of contacting Jimi Hendrix's drummer, Mitch Mitchell, but no sessions took place. The urban legend that they played with Hendrix is not true. Keith's manager Tony Stratton Smith recommended Carl Palmer. So where did Palmer come from? Born in the West Midlands, Birmingham in March 1950, he recorded a couple of pop rock hits in 1966 with both the Craig and the Chants before joining Chris Farlow and the Thunderbirds. 1969 saw him replace the drummer for The Crazy World of Arthur Brown, who left the band midway through the North American tour that year. I checked the records and they played 11 dates in some venues where Led Zeppelin rocked the house, like Chicago's Kinetic Playground, Schaefer Musical Festival, and the Rockpile, Toronto. While Carl Palmer can be seen on a Crazy World of Arthur Brown video, he did not record any music in the studio with them. By August 1969, Carl Palmer left the band with keyboard player Vincent Crane to form their power trio Atomic Rooster, featuring Nick Graham on vocals and bass. Past 13 concert dates in late 1969, they recorded their self-titled album December through January. Carl Palmer played 11 dates with Atomic Rooster on their European tour of 1970, January through June. Keith Emerson and Greg Lake were pushy. They pressured Carl into joining their band after a brief jam session with all three musicians, which was deemed terrific. Palmer left Atomic Rooster in June. The final piece of the puzzle was set. King Crimson's In the Wake of Poseidon, featuring Greg Lake, was released in May 1970. The band decided on the name Emerson, Lake and Palmer after considering Triton, Triumvirate, and Seahorse. Fun fact, Triumvirate was a heavily ELP-inspired prog band from West Germany. ELP's rehearsal sessions were conducted at Island Studios in June 1970, the same place where Led Zeppelin would record rhythm tracks for Stairway to Heaven in December. ELP's repertoire included several adaptations of classical pieces, plus the Nice's live powerhouse, Blue Rondo a la Turk. Also in the works was Pictures at an Exhibition, which was developed in parallel to the other songs. A Moog synthesizer was brought from the States to enhance Keith's sound palette. One last record by the Nice was released in June 1970. 5 Bridges featured the 1969 orchestra project, plus a live recording at the Fillmore East and one studio outtake. Long before Keith Emerson's piano concerto from Works 1, the 5 Bridges suite was a prophetic piece into the artistic ventures of 1977. ELP's self-titled debut was recorded July through September 1970 at Advision Studios London, where Yes captured their first 2 albums by February that year. Now let's take a look at the songs from ELP's debut, engineered by Eddie Offord, the same man behind many Yes classics. The album's cover painting was done by British artist Nick Darnell. With its Baroque style, it was a perfect image to kickstart ELP's career, flying into the unknown, carrying the spirit of the forefathers of classical music. The Barbarian kicks off the album with a proto-heavy metal opening motif based on Hungarian composer Bela Bartok's Allegro Barbaro from 1911, a dissonant statement that announced the arrival of the 1970s while pushing the boundaries of rock into intellectual greatness. Bartok's widow would later contact the band, as original pressings of the album did not feature the Hungarian composer's name on the credits. The track was played some 41 times on stage until 1972, when it was retired from the set, until ELP's 2010 High Voltage reunion. The song's middle section is built around a fast jazz construction, with Palmer playing with brushes. Unlike Emerson's previous work with the Nice, joining harmonic forces with Greg Lake proved to be the perfect balance, as Lake's producer role helped to round the rough edges from Emerson's previous psychedelic period. In other words, Lake managed to capture the group's intensity without compromising the listening experience. I believe he doesn't get enough credit for this. Greg Lake, the rock producer. Track 2, Take a Pebble, was a Lake composition featuring creative sounds by Keith Emerson on the opening segment, where he would strum the piano strings from the inside to achieve the iconic introduction sound. It is also worth mentioning Emerson's call and response parts, using elements from jazz and flamenco. Lake's voice is one of the most exquisite tones in progressive rock history. Palmer carefully decorated the opening verses with cymbals, before jumping into a fast segment where Greg Lake's magnificent counterpoint bass work elevates Keith's piano mastery. The song's middle section of acoustic guitar provided great contrast to the dynamics, with a live in the studio feel jam to it. Take a Pebble was featured in pretty much all of ELP's shows throughout the 70s. Track 3, Knife Edge, was a clever variation on 2 classical themes. First off, there's Czech composer Leos Janak's Sinfonietta from 1926. Check out the first movement. Greg Lake's vocals on Knife Edge are a direct reference to his King Crimson bravado, thus becoming the hard rock competitor for the 1970s market. Emerson's keyboard solo at the end is an adaptation from Johann Sebastian Bach's French Suite No. 1 in D minor. It became one of ELP's signature songs at their concerts. Track 4, The Three Fates, is a Keith Emerson suite featuring just about every aspect of his playing and creative mind, comprised in a 7-minute and 46 seconds piece. It also works as a best of moments from the Nice, managing to show his capabilities and composition style, including odd meters of 7/8 in one of the movements. The pipe organ part was recorded at Royal Festival Hall, where Rick Wakeman played his Journey to the Center of the Earth in 1974. Track 5, Tank, credited to both Emerson and Palmer, is a drum solo exhibit with an opening riff similar to Led Zeppelin's How Many More Times, released in January of 1969. Outside of a couple of shows in 1971, Tank was retired from the set as Carl Palmer's drum solo was eventually featured in another song. Tank came back for their Works tour of 1977, making great use of the orchestra during the portions where they could afford such luxurious ensemble. Closing number on the album is the world-famous Lucky Man, written by Greg Lake when he was 12 years old. Story goes the song was recorded one late afternoon. Greg played his guitar parts and Emerson checked in. He didn't know about this acoustic piece as a part of their progressive rock debut. Layers of bass guitar and added vocals plus Carl Palmer's drumming got Emerson to try out the Moog synthesizer, a first take where Keith tried out different keyboard lines. Greg Lake and Eddie Offord loved it. Emerson thought it was, quote, the most mediocre solo I've ever played. It was left on the final release and became a live concert staple the fans wanted to hear, note by note. Dr. Robert Moog himself had a synthesizer delivered to Emerson weeks later with a message. All of her previous products were made as supplements for recording studios that were not designed for road use. I understand that you want to tour with your instrument, so as an experiment, we have built a preset box that will enable you to have up to 8 different sounds. Thank you, Dr. Moog. Greg Lake's solo on Lucky Man was played on a Fender Telecaster next to his beloved Gibson J200 for the rest. The band's secret weapon throughout the 70s, a killer acoustic song to find new audiences, past the complex musicianship the band was known for. The influence of Greg Lake's piece in G major cannot be ignored. It further validated the use of acoustic guitars in rock, where very few dare to enter, never mind create an actual memorable composition. Lucky Man was the second most played song by Emerson and Palmer. ELP played 2 shows in the middle of recording their debut album. Their live show premiere took place on August 23rd at the Plymouth Guildhall for about 2,000 ticket holders. It was quite the small warm-up just 6 days before ELP's spot on the 5-day Isle of Wight festival of 1970, with both Emerson and Lake playing the festival in 1969 with their previous bands. It made sense to have them back with a brand new trio the huge crowd of 600,000 people was yet to experience. ELP took the stage on Saturday, August 29th, 1970. Among the list of artists that day were Joni Mitchell, Miles Davis, 10 Years After, The Doors, The Who, and Sly and the Family Stone. As you think, ELP's show was the most intense, including 2 cannons going off at the end of Pictures at Exhibition. Their 5-song setlist was recorded and further cemented their place as progressive rock pioneers. The band's performance was one for the record books that no other band from that era could rival. Keith Emerson's performance can only be compared to Jimi Hendrix's Monterey Pop Festival moment, setting his guitar on fire. Although it wasn't a debut, it felt like one. The band had arrived. Emerson and Palmer's self-titled album sold about 500,000 copies, taking the 70th position on the best-selling albums for 1970. Sales figures were similar to Elton John's self-titled second studio album, Blood, Sweat and Tears 3, and Bread's second album, On the Waters. ELP was just 100,000 units below Lila and Other Assorted Love Songs. It ranks number 9 in ELP's all-time sales, right behind Tarkus, Welcome Back My Friends, the live album, and Trilogy. And yes, just if you're wondering, Love Beach sold more copies than all the previous albums I mentioned, but they were famous by then, so it makes sense. You can check my documentary on this infamous release here on the channel. Past the Isle of Wight atomic bomb, ELP embarked on a 22-day tour of the UK before going to Germany, Austria, and Switzerland in November, just in time for their album release on the 20th. Also released that month was George Harrison's All Things Must Pass, Cat Stevens' Tea for Tillerman. This was the perfect setting for Lucky Man to score riches, right? Also we have Gentle Giants, Curved Airs, and Kraftwerk's debut albums, Syd Barrett's final studio record of new material, and King Crimson bandmates MacDonald and Giles' duet collaboration. So back to ELP's tour. While Tank was not played in full, Carl Palmer's drum solo was featured in the setlist for a maximum rockstar effect. With every show came greater skill that further developed their chemistry into a high-impact industrious musical unit capable of incredibly demanding structures and virtuoso level concentration. Their stamina was second to none. By the time they played their last date on their famous Beat Club TV show appearance on December 31st, Emerson and Palmer was only 7 months into their existence. While record sales slowly took off, their live show value quickly grew into one of rock and roll's hottest ticket. A display of instrumental extravaganza and pristine-sounding vocals had to be witnessed firsthand. Now the UK charts for December 1970 had ELP's debut at number 4, just 3 steps behind Led Zeppelin's third album and 4 steps above Deep Purple's In Rock. New songs were born in the minds of Emerson and Palmer while traveling in a van previously owned by Yes. 1971 would be a prosperous year for ELP. They went back into the studio in January for Tarkus, recorded a live rendition of Pictures at Exhibition in March, and began sessions for Trilogy in October. All of this was built on the foundations of 60s psychedelia and the composer's legacy of Sibelius, Brubeck, Bartók, and Johann Sebastian Bach. Before late 70s accusations of self-indulgence and love beaches, there was Emerson and Palmer, the rebels with a cause to change the face of progressive rock forever. Lucky men they were. I want to thank my dear patrons for funding the research for this episode. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share the link on your social media platforms, as it helps with word of mouth publicity. Stay safe. Bye bye.